Thank you so much, Judy. That was probably one of the nicest introductions I've ever had, and so thank you. I'm delighted to be here. In fact, I'm honored to be here because Wisconsin, it's my first time here, and Wisconsin is known not only for being one of the leading schools in my discipline of political science, but also one of the leading lights in the study of Southeast Asia. So I'm doubly honored to be here, and I couldn't be happier to be able to share my work with you. New mentioned a few things. One was about studying China in comparative perspective, and I can't help but, I was going to start with a disclaimer, which is to say that my day job is Chinese politics. My pursuit of Cambodian politics and history is something that kind of came afterwards, even though my interest in Cambodia preceded my interest in China. I'm happy to get into that during the Q&A or over lunch or what have you. I remember it was I guess it was my first year in the government department at Cornell when I had a colleague named Sid Tarrow. Those of you who are political scientists, you might know the name. He came into my office and he said, you should really be a real comparativist. Not just China, but really, study China in the context of a comparative perspective with another country, another region, sets of countries, what have you. And at the time, I was interested in a project on rectification in China, or thought reform. And so he suggested, well, you should maybe compare China with fascist Italy on that subject. And of course, Sid studies Italy, and so I said, thanks, I'll take that under advisement. But I really thought about it because it was not Italy so much, but about the opportunities that were there. I'd just come from Washington University in St. Louis, which is very much a kind of a positivist approach to political science. They have a very strong East Asia program there. But once I got to Cornell, Sid's suggestion really made me think about the fact that we had resources on Southeast Asia at Cornell, and in fact they do offer Khmer language. And so my initial interest in Cambodia, I could actually, this wasn't something that was simply something to do as a hobby, but really something that I could potentially pursue in a scholarly capacity. So whereas I would never consider myself a Cambodia expert or even a Cambodia scholar, I feel much more comfortable saying that I'm a student of Cambodia. Nonetheless, what New was speaking about is that there is in fact life after tenure. So just something for you to keep in mind down the road. So I'm very, very happy to talk to you today about this book that just came out in May. Spoiler alert, it is free. It is open access. So at the very end, because my editor insisted that I do so, there's a QR code that you can take a picture with your phone, which will allow you to download the book, either through Cornell University Press or Amazon. Doesn't matter, it's the same price, which is nothing. But it's an experiment in open access, so we'll see how it goes. But this talk is not really to substitute for reading the book, and what I mean by that is very often I listen to podcasts. I do a lot of driving. I commute between Ithaca and Washington, D.C., so I listen to a lot of podcasts. And one of the things that's kind of frustrating is that I listen to a podcast on a book that sounds absolutely fascinating based on the podcast, and then I find that the podcast was far more interesting than the book was. And so what I want to kind of do the opposite here, give you a somewhat more boring talk that will somehow get you interested in actually opening up the book and reading it. And so what I'm not going to go into as much depth on a number of different dimensions within the book. Happy to do so during the Q&A, but when I say something along the lines of, and I talk much more about it in the book, trust me that is actually true. So in the time that I have, and I don't have a whole lot of time because I do want to, I don't want to kind of bleed into the Q&A section of the talk. What I want to do is I want to give a little bit of history and background for those of you who might not have much of a background in Cambodia. I will then lay out what the research question was that guided this research, the data collection, which might be of interest to particularly to graduate students, and I'm always happy to talk about just the art of field research and archival research such as I can. I'll talk about a very little bit about the framework, and this might be of interest to people who, this is very much an interdisciplinary book. It's neither fish nor fowl. It's not history. It's not political science. It's some strange hybrid, either in between or adjacent to those two. But one of the reasons why that came to be, I think I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of my framework and approach. I'll give you the largest part of the talk will be the summary. So I'll give just a quick rundown of the summary, and then end with some larger questions that I came up with. But one of the most wonderful things about scholarship is that some of the most interesting questions don't necessarily come from yourself, but from people who read your work and come up with ideas and conclusions and extrapolations and extensions that you never thought of. And so I'm very much looking forward to any of that, either here today or down the road, as hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation. So, in any case, let me start with kind of a very, very brief backgrounder. And again, for those of you who are either from Cambodia or who are experts in Cambodia, please do indulge me in whatever shortcomings I demonstrate in presenting this fascinating and tragic political history. So Cambodia became an independent from France, being a French protectorate in 1953, and the era from 1953 until 1970 was referred to kind of as in shorthand as the Sankom, which was a shorthand for the party and the political project of Norodom Sihanouk, who was king but advocated in favor of his father so that he could play a more direct role in politics. And he really, I think it's safe to say that Sihanouk dominated the politics, the culture, the history, and the aesthetics of Cambodia up until 1970. In 1970, he was deposed by a group of people led by Lon Nol. Lon Nol took the reins of the Khmer Republic from 1970 until 1975. During that time, that was kind of also known as the period of Cambodian Civil War, which I will come back to. And it's also, if I wanted to just say about where my initial interest in Cambodia came from, I'm dating myself here, but I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I would watch the evening news, and because the U.S. and Vietnam had already reached a peace agreement, the lead story was either the first lead story or the second one on the evening news was Cambodia. So when I was at a fairly young age, I was exposed to these really indelible images, and so I think that was where my initial interest in Cambodia came from. After 1975, there were the 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of Khmer Rouge rule, broadly known as the Democratic Kampuchea period. You have, in 1979, you have the invasion of Vietnam from 1979 to 1989, and then beyond that, you had the UN-sponsored elections You had the UN in Cambodia from 1991. The elections were in 1993, which led to an outcome that was almost immediately questioned and pushed back on it. And so for a period of 4 years, you had two co-prime ministers. You had Prince Norodom Ranariddh and Hun Sen. And then in 1997, you had, whether or not you want to call it a coup, this is something that is very much being continued to be debated. You had Hun Sen taking power in 1997, and really from that point up to the present, or up until 2 years ago or so, when Hun Sen stepped down in favor of his son Hun Manet, he was more or less in charge of Cambodia at the very top of the system. As we get more and more to recent Cambodian political history, I would defer to other people who are far more familiar with that than I am. So what is the research question? This research project began with a lot of different fits and starts, but basically in on April 17th of 1975, so almost exactly 50 years ago, the Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh and other provincial capitals of Cambodia, and almost immediately started to forcibly expel the residents from those cities into the countryside. Within hours, entire city blocks, entire neighborhoods were forced into the countryside with little more than the clothing that was on their backs. This was done so there were a number of reasons, both stated and unstated, why this was so. For the sake of this talk, the reason that resonates the most is that to essentially do away with all class distinctions in one fell swoop. For the next almost 4 years, Cambodia essentially became a classless society in that you had all the kind of the non-agricultural, non-rural classes become agricultural and rural classes. And although there were distinctions between people who were expelled from the cities, between those who had been in the countryside throughout the Cambodian Civil War period, it's one can refer to all of Cambodia as more or less one huge kind of classless experiment in rural development. And of course, for even people who do not know much about Cambodia, they're aware of the fact that during the Khmer Rouge period, so during this less than 4-year period, you had up to, and depending on what your estimates are, up to a quarter of the population dying either through executions, through disease, or through overwork and negligence. And so when the Vietnamese invaded, that became, there were all sorts of whispers and refugee reports about things that were going on in Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge era, but really after early 1979, those stories became impossible to ignore, and it became a matter of the historical record. And that's why what happened next is so baffling, and this is the research question. So following one of the bloodiest political experiments in modern history, the Khmer Rouge were bounded after 1979 to rule over vast swaths of Cambodian territory for another 2 decades. More than 5 times as long as it had officially ruled Cambodia as Democratic Kampuchea. And throughout this time, it enjoyed a significant measure of public support against its adversaries in the countryside, pockets of which continue to the present day. And indeed, if you go to certain parts of Cambodia, one of my research sites was along the Thai-Cambodian border in a town called An Long Beng. And up there are not just pockets of supporters of the Khmer Rouge regime, but one can say that the entire communities are based upon people who had either benefited or otherwise supported that regime. This, for example, one of the people I'm going to be talking about today is a guy named Tamo, and this is a hospital that he financed up in An Long Veng. He's very much seen not as a war criminal, but rather as a favorite son. And so how to make sense of all of this. And so my question really is, what explains the durability of the Khmer Rouge movement, particularly after 1979, when the atrocities that occurred under their watch became a matter of the public record, all the way up to its demise in 1997. So, data collection. How did I go about trying to research, trying to come up with the data to answer this question? There are a number of different sources. The first are, there's a Cambodia scholar par excellence named Steve Hedder, who had amassed an extraordinary trove of resources in a private archive. I had reached out to Steve back in 2016 when I began this project. Actually, when this project got its second wind, because I'd started it before that and things were not going anywhere, and I was about this close to giving up on it. And Steve encouraged me to stick with it. And one of the things that really helped me decide to stick with it was the fact that Steve opened his archives for me to be able to kind of look at the materials that he had collected throughout this period to be able to draw from. So that was a huge part of it. The second part of it had to do with site visits. Whether it was through my own research, I had helped establish a course, intercession course in Cambodia at Cornell when I was there, called Cornell in Cambodia. It was a 2-week course, so I would take my students to various Khmer Rouge sites, including areas that became key places where these events that I talk about occurred. This is a photograph that I took of Pol Pot, the inside of Pol Pot's bunker in the Dangrek Mountains outside of An Long Veng, it was there's a term that's taking on more currency these days. It's what is it? It's touching the grass. Is that what it is? It's this notion of I refer to it as, for those of you who are cinephiles like myself, it's like the scenes in Gladiator when Russell Crowe would crouch down and feel the sand or feel the earth where he was to kind of create some sort of metaphysical understanding and community with the physical spaces that he was forced to act within. And so for me, it's very important to actually be able to go out and see the sites that one is researching and breathe the air and touch the grass, if you will. So that was a big part of it. Another big part of it was field interviews. Up until about 2014 or so, it was fairly easy for me to reach out to people in Cambodia and just sit down and chat with them. Nobody, or very few people could give a very kind of long narrative over topics that I was interested in. So a lot of it was kind of putting little fragments of information together. A lot of the people that I interviewed were, both for this project and the project before, were either ex-Khmer Rouge soldiers on the front line or cadres at a low level. But in some cases, I was able to speak to people at kind of at middle management, if you will, more for the Brothers in Arms book that came before this. That was very helpful in terms of me kind of trying to put together kind of what a state under the Khmer Rouge looked like. Alongside, but distinct from, to the degree that was possible, from the killing apparatus that has been the focus of many excellent books and articles on the Khmer Rouge. In some cases, I was able to meet with some elites. But one of the problems with doing field interviews on something that is kind of historically grounded is these people get old and they die. And so during the period of the work on this project, many of the people who I interviewed have since passed on. Also, during COVID, I was obviously unable to do field research, and so I was benefited from recruiting some really wonderful Confederates who were in Cambodia and who were able to undertake research on my behalf, and I owe them a tremendous debt. Finally, one of the things that was really, really interesting and worthwhile that I didn't think would be so, and this was really kind of, it was my editor that pushed me on this, was to look at the files from the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, or the War Crimes Tribunal. And a lot of this information is online. Full disclosure, I worked as a consultant for one of the defense teams, yes, one of the defense teams at the ECCC. So I had access to a number of documents even before they were put fully online, which was very, very helpful, not because, I mean, these focused mostly on the Democratic Kampuchea period, which is one of the periods of time that I spent time on, but that was not where most of the, hopefully, value added, insofar as there is any of the book, comes to bear. Had much more to do with the ECCC documents. Were very, very helpful in terms of me piecing together the history of, particularly from 1970 to 1975. Because many of the people who were interviewed, many of the witnesses, and these were people who were within the movement. They were asked how did they join the movement, why did they join the movement, what was it, what did they do during that time period, and because there's so many of these interviews, it was possible for me to not only be able to kind of piece together these parts of history, but also when they were asked to comment on the various individuals that figure very prominently in the book, they would have the kinds of anecdotes, they would have the kinds of personal experiences that would help me be able to round out and flesh out these individuals. And that's really important for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. So the framework is one that I can't necessarily take full responsibility for, because it was one that was kind of made kind of clear to me in a number of different conversations with David Chandler, who many of you know as the doyen of Cambodian, the study of Cambodian history and politics. So if this was my question, I was thinking about how might I, what are some of the ways in which I might be able to explore this? And this really came from informal conversations that I've had with David over the years. We're both New Yorkers. I'm from Manhattan, he's from Queens, so we had that bond. He's also somebody who was a very easy person to chat with, to talk with, and so over the course of conferences and many AASs, over many beers, there was this theme that would come up in our conversations. David was no fan of the Khmer Rouge, but beyond that, he also was fairly adamant on the fact that they weren't necessarily, in addition to kind of all the kind of horrific kind of evil things that they did and represented, they also weren't terribly. They were mediocre. Let's put it this way. They were not these are not the kinds of people that you're thinking, wow, they did all these horrible things, but they weren't Stalin-esque, or they weren't Maoist in that regard, because you can point to Stalin doing all these really quite horrible things, but he also he was somebody who was able to had these types of achievements that whether or not you like them or agree with them, you can't deny their existence, and you can say the same thing about Mao. Can't really say the same thing about Pol Pot. You can't really say the things about Nguyen Chia. And so basically what David came down to was that the Khmer Rouge were good at basically two things and two things only. They were adept at forming and exploiting a united front, and they were good at class struggle. And that was basically it. And so I took David's I took his framework, and I really tried to see how I can, how I might be able to test that, if you will. Essentially, the framework that I came up with was this notion that the Khmer Rouge as a movement never really achieved. Now, those of you who are political scientists, you can the notion of equilibrium can be very, very important. And in the case of the Khmer Rouge, they never really could or necessarily even sought some sort of political equilibrium, with one exception that I'll get to, and that was an abject failure. But I'll just ask you to bookmark that for the moment. Rather, they moved from one extreme, which is to say United Front, to another, class struggle. And when they reached the logical endpoint of one, there was really only one other place for them to go, and that was whichever the other one was. And in making this argument, what I was able to do was to kind of move away from the way in which we look at the Khmer Rouge as a movement, because we oftentimes look at it as something that might be a bit of an aberration, a bit of an outlier, kind of something that happened when all the planets aligned, and was kind of a one-off. And what I'm arguing is, in fact, that there was more of a cyclical dynamic going on. So rather than looking at it as the movement as an example of time's arrow, I think it might be worth us looking at it as more cyclical. And if we look at it more cyclically, then we can kind of trace out what was going on for a longer period of time. Let me, the Yates quote, by the way, is not from me, it's from my editor. She has, she's much more of a kind of a refined scholar than I am, and so she kind of put that there. But it made me think more about this idea of the center not holding. So if we look at things through a linear timeline, essentially, and we look at the time period that I sketched out at the very, very beginning, really, Democratic Kampuchea takes up kind of one time period here, and it's easier, and maybe for just us as fellow humanists, to a bit of a relief that this was just something that acted very much as a one-off. And so really much of the work that's done really focuses on the time period between 1975 and 1979. Sure, there's some, they talk about how the Khmer Rouge came to power, and yes, as we get farther and farther away from that time frame, there's been some kind of either addenda or epilogues or things like that, looking at kind of post-1979 shelf life of the Khmer Rouge, but that hasn't really necessarily been an actual focus. But if we look at it cyclically, and we look at it through the twin prisms of the United Front and through class struggle, we're able to really explain the dynamics of this movement from 1970 really all the way to 1997, which at least helps us analyze the research question that I posed at the beginning, and at least try to provide some sort of an answer to at least parts of that question. Okay, so that's the framework, and then the approach, and then I'll finally get into the summary, which again I'll kind of breeze through fairly quickly so that we have time for the Q&A. This was, for me, one of the most difficult parts of the project, which is I have all this data, I have the research question, I have the framework. How am I going to actually sit down and write about this, present the data that I have in a way that does justice to the data, but also where where I don't make claims that I cannot make. And one of the problems that I have, and I talk about this at the very beginning, is that of the book in the introduction, is that going back to Chandler's notion of Khmer Rouge mediocrity, anytime you do a structured comparison between the Khmer Rouge and, say, a country that I know much better, say China, the comparison makes Cambodia, it diminishes Cambodia. It makes it seem less. It does not place, I think, the experience of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge onto kind of the large, the platform of larger questions that it really deserves to be placed. And so it was really difficult for me to, and as a political scientist, the scientist part of it was a real source of tension because, of course, as political scientists, we're not supposed to look at individual idiosyncrasies. We're supposed to look at systematic structures and processes over classes of phenomena. And so looking at these really, I don't think, privileged a way that was apparent to me anyway, an approach that could really animate the data that I was able to kind of put together. And so I thought about this in a number of different ways, and I ended up deciding to focus on, in my approach, to focus on individual leaders. And this had a number of, in fact, I did so to the point where I had to make some sacrifices. So this is more kind of an inside baseball thing, but I think it's worth pointing out. I initially submitted the manuscript to Cambridge University Press. And in part because I had promised the editor that I would give her the right of first refusal, and because I wanted the Cambridge University Press author discount, because the other books had all been with Cornell University Press. And sent it out for review. The reviews came back; they were fine. They both suggested some substantial changes, which is part of the process. But they wanted me to write a book that was different from the book I wanted to write. They didn't want me to focus on leaders as much. I think they probably sent it out to some political scientists who, for whom this was not really kind of the direction they would have liked to have seen the book go. So I contacted the editor and I told her that that's not the book I want to write. I'm happy to pay for the external reviews, but I'd like to take the manuscript elsewhere. She was very generous and said, "Don't worry about it, that's perfectly fine, I totally get it." And I took it to Cornell University Press. And the editor there, Jackie Keogh, is extraordinary, and she got it immediately and very much kind of pushed me to do even more of what I wanted to do. And so there was very little daylight between us. Now, the utility of looking at individual leaders was severalfold. The first was, when I look at China, when I approach my own scholarship on China, it's mostly on policy making and policy enforcement or policy implementation, with a real emphasis on the second part of it, on the policy enforcement and on the policy implementation. That's kind of what I was doing here. By not focusing on Pol Pot, by not focusing on Nguyen Chia, instead what I did was I focused on three of their top lieutenants. Those three were Iang Sari, Son Sen, and Tamo. And that's where the title of the book emerged from. Really looking at kind of three of the top enforcers of the Khmer Rouge movement. Three of the survivors. It was also useful to look at them because they were more or less survivors from the very, very beginning of the movement, all the way until the implosion of the movement, or just before it, in 1998. Son Sen died in 1997. I'll get to that in just a moment. But that was really kind of the end point. They were active throughout this entire period, so you could look at these dynamics of class struggle and United Front through the political biographies of these three people. Additionally, the fact that these are very, very different individuals, and the argument that I made, I didn't go as far as to say that this explains variation on the independent and dependent variables like any good political scientist would, but rather I did suggest in the book that there were some of these, out of these three lieutenants, One of them, Iang Sari, was much more comfortable on the United Front side of the spectrum. Another, Tao Mok, was much more comfortable on the class struggle side of the spectrum. And curiously, Son Sen was somewhere in between, and I'll explain this in just a moment. But I thought by looking at the political biographies of these three people and really making it personal, kind of getting into the trenches where you can really kind of see, feel, and kind of be in the same room with these people, that would be a more satisfying exploration into these questions. And hopefully that's what I was able to achieve. Of course, it's the readers, the audience, that will make that determination, not me. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is just give you kind of a summary outline of the book through all of these various moving parts that I've laid out. And I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly and just trust me that I do so in a more systematic and in more depth and more breadth in the pages of the book. So I look at the First United Front, and rather than look at it from 1970 to 1975, I look at it from just after the coup, not the coup, but because technically it wasn't a coup, but essentially the deposing of Sihanouk in March of 1970, the creation of a United Front of royalists, of Vietnamese communists, whether it was South Vietnamese communists or Hanoi-backed North Vietnamese regulars, and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were very much the junior partners in this relationship in 1970. They were a barely viable political force, not one to be reckoned with. During this time, Iang Sari had moved to Beijing to essentially represent the Khmer Rouge, actually to represent the coalition in Beijing. Son Sen was consolidating his control over the military and security really initially in the northeastern part of the country, and then increasingly at a more kind of overall level. And Tao Mok was, among with a number of other military leaders at the time, was establishing his own power within a certain geographic area of Cambodia, in his case, the southwest. And so this was all taking place during the Cambodian Civil War. The first class struggle did not begin, I argue, in 1975, but in fact began in 1973. Which is to say that I make the claim, and it's not completely free of controversy, but I make the claim that the things that became essentially supersized to countrywide policy in 1975 were already very much at work in Khmer Rouge-controlled areas of the countryside, beginning in 1973. And I talk about this in the book. I'll summarize the anecdote because it's one that's really quite striking. One of the people I was able to interview for the book was former U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia, Kenneth Quinn. In 1973, he was he staffed one of the U.S. consulates in Vietnam, in this case in Can Tho, and one afternoon or one day one Saturday in June of 1973, he and his wife climbed a mountain nearby. Sam Mountain, which was right on the border between Cambodia and Vietnam. And they went up there to have a picnic. They reached the top of the mountain, and when they looked over into Cambodia, and there's about a 15-mile or so view to the edge of the horizon, every village that they could see was on fire. So they saw these menacing billowings of black smoke. And Ken Quinn was an agronomist by training, so he knew what Sweden-induced fire on on crops that weren't being on fallow crops looked like, and this was not it. And in fact, what he was seeing was the actual shift towards class struggle among Khmer Rouge controlled areas in the countryside, which by 1973 was the majority of the Cambodian landmass. During that time, you had a shift of leadership from the royalists of the coalition to the Khmer Rouge. Essentially had been working their subterfuge behind the scenes. They started to take control over the politics of these coalition held areas. The Vietnamese were unceremoniously expelled from their role within the coalition. And you start to see the collectivization of agriculture within Cambodia. And this is something that continued into the democratic Cambodia, so into 1975 and beyond. During this time, Sun Sen established and managed the killing apparatus, and this was not something that was a hands-off type of operation for him. In this is one of the files of one of the people tortured at Tuol Sleng, and you can see that the annotations 1, 2, 3 up there are in Sun Sen's handwriting under the nom de guerre of Q. So this was somebody who he would have. We hear a lot about the operation of S-21 under its commandant, whose nom de guerre is Duik. Sun Sen and Duik had daily conversations on how things were going, and so this was something where Sun Sen was very much involved in a very kind of direct and micro management level. And then Mok, during this time, was really establishing his own consolidation over the various parts of Cambodia as zone commander. So Cambodia did away with the provinces and it was reorganized into zones, each of which was essentially under the command of a zone secretary. Mok was in charge of the southwest, but as these various other zone commanders came under suspicion, it was Mok and another zone commander, Kapol. The two of them were the ones who essentially managed the purge and consolidation of the troops under these disgraced zone secretaries. So that by the end of 1978, a good part of the military occupation or organization of Cambodia was ultimately under Sun Sen, but was under the direct management and a result of the intervention of Tam Mok and his armies. So this just gives you an example of what the zones looked like under democratic Kampuchea. And then during this time, Yang Sari was handling things on the kind of the outward-looking side of the regime. This was a regime known as being very secretive, very inward-looking, and non-transparent. Perhaps the most transparent part of it was the foreign ministry, codenamed B1, and so Yang Sari was very much the kind of the outward-looking face of the regime to many people. And I write about the tensions, and people like Sun Sen and Tam Mok really had no difficulties at all with the killing of key segments of the Cambodian population. For Yang Sari, at the very least, it interfered with his ability to undertake kind of a viable apparatus for representing Cambodia abroad, and so it created tensions within that apparatus, which I get into in much more detail in the book. The Second United Front was inked in June of 1982 between the Party of Democratic Kampuchea, which would be the Khmer Rouge, the KPNLF, which was mostly, you could substitute as being Republicans, the survivors, or otherwise people that would be the secular non-loyalists. And then the Funcinpak Party was eventually under Sihanouk's son, Ranariddh. The Second United Front really took place between 1982 and 1989. They all kind of worked to strengthen their own positions. In the words of John Pilligar, the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea was neither a coalition nor a government, nor was it democratic, nor was it in Kampuchea. A big part of it was outside of Cambodia, on the Thai-Cambodian border. I'm going to come back to that because that's really, really key. So Ieng Sary mostly maintained an outward facing role during all of this at the United Nations and elsewhere. And insofar as within Cambodia, the camps that were on the Thai-Cambodian border that were under Ieng Sary's direct control were very much Potemkin villages. They were not accurate of the horrors that were going on in many of the other camps, but were rather orchestrated to look inviting and underscore that everything was fine under the Khmer Rouge controlled camps. And the reason why the camps are so important is because each of these three coalition partners, I talk a lot about this in the book, and I'm only going to breeze through it here, was that the camps became consolidated over time from basically something like a dozen or two camps at the beginning of the decade to a consolidation of maybe a half dozen or so, 6 or 7 camps by 1991. And each of these consolidated camps belonged to one or the other of these three coalition partners. And the reason why this is important is because these camps served as staging areas for military and political activity within Cambodia, even though that's not what they were supposed to do. So, for example, during this time, you had Son Sen and you had Mok take over different swaths of Cambodian territory. This would have been like Son Sen's area over here, this would have been Mok's area over there, and the camps served as key resources for logistics, recruiting soldiers, and the areas nearby the camps were key areas for Khmer Rouge commanders to be briefed and educated by Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia. And so I talk a lot about it in the book. I can't really talk much about it here because I just have a few minutes left. But just these are some photographs of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in 1983. There's a Japanese photographer that everybody from this era remember with real fondness. He was supposed to be like everybody's best friend and just a wonderful guy to hang out with, to the point where the Khmer Rouge acceded to his request for him to follow them for a few weeks inside of Cambodia during this time. So he took a bunch of photographs that his estate was very happy, or was very kind to. I was very happy. They were very kind to license to me. So these are just some pictures of the logistics, the logistical lines that these camps allowed to happen, and these are troops in Cambodia. So this continued throughout the 1980s, and the Khmer Rouge were able to build up some key rapport with people in these rural communities within Cambodia, which made them think that when the Vietnamese finally left, they would be able to essentially take back control over Cambodia, whether through just a withering away of the Vietnamese occupied state or through some other means. It turned out to be some other means. And so that's where kind of the strange period from 1991 and 1993 come in, because Pol Pot was convinced that the Khmer Rouge would win and win big if they competed in elections. That assumption came to a halt in 1991 when Sun Sen had already returned to Phnom Penh to essentially prepare the way for Khieu Samphan, who was one of the more kind of well-known Khmer Rouge leaders, even though he was somebody who did not have an independent power base. He came to Cambodia in the fall of that year, came from the airport, went to a villa where the Khmer Rouge had their headquarters, and was beaten by the crowds to the point where his safety could not be guaranteed, and he, along with Son Sen, returned back to Thailand that same evening by plane. And this was something that convinced Pol Pot eventually that the elections were not going to work, and led to the boycotting of the elections by the Khmer Rouge. Not surprisingly, after the elections, you have the final kind of cyclical shift back to class struggle. During this time, young Sadie had been increasingly sidelined, really from the mid to late 1980s up to this point, eventually defecting in 1996. But even before that, so back in 1986, there was a document, this one over here, that was made available by a defecting soldier from Tamok's army, and this was essentially a screed talking about how the other coalition partners are more worthy of more suspicion than the Vietnamese are, and that it just underscored the fact that the Khmer Rouge planned to, at best, jettison. And at worst, go after its coalition partners when the time is right. And this is from 1986. This is an outline of a scorched earth policy from 1994, which essentially started to repeat many of the things that you saw in the countryside from 1973 to 1975, and then nationwide after 1975. So you have Young Sari's defection over here. For Mok, you had him reestablishing his power base in An Long Beng, Pol Pot joining him there in the early 1990s, and things like the elimination of money, which again was something that occurred 20 years before that, as well as going after various groups, both Cambodian as well as Lao, Thai, and Westerners, particularly backpackers. In 1994, you saw something like a dozen or so backpackers being kidnapped for ransom, and whether or not the ransom was paid, they were nonetheless executed. You had Sun Sen holding on to power, increasingly under suspicion by Pol Pot. And in fact, in June of 1997, Pol Pot led his forces to go after both Tamok and Son Sen. They succeeded in executing Son Sen, his wife Yun Yat, and 3 generations of their family. And Tamok was not there and was able to mobilize his army. You had basically a week to 10-day long campaign between Pol Pot's army and that of Tamok's. The result was Pol Pot was captured, he was put on trial, put under house arrest, and then died a year later on April 15th of 1998, with Tamok being quite literally the last man standing. He was eventually taken under custody and died under custody in 2006. So what are the larger questions? In the minute or so that I have left, for me, the one question that I've been really fascinated by looking at China was the difference between the rise to power, the skills necessary to win a revolution. So most communist revolutions fail, and those that succeed tend to have a key, to use a Maoist term, contradiction in terms of how do they actually govern. So the same skill set to blow up train tracks are not the same skill set to make those trains run on time. So how does it, how do you move from one to the other? This is a picture in June of 1975 with Pol Pot and Iang Sari meeting with Mao Zedong. And during that meeting, Mao had told them, don't do what we did. Now, what does that mean? Mao was famously enigmatic. They took his meaning to be, and I actually share this interpretation, to be, don't pull your punches like we did. Don't moderate like we forced ourselves to do. Don't hold back. And they didn't hold back. In doing so, you can make the argument, as I have, that the Khmer Rouge really never softened their stance or never kind of went back on their on the things that made their rise to power successful. Their revolution was a continuation of that moving forward. So, for example, when you look at the Soviet Union, you have all these socialist realist photos of of determined communists. And then you compare that with the day-to-day kind of the bread lines and things like that. There's a real contrast between the rise to power and the rule and the actual exercise of governance. That case, you can make that even more so under the Chinese communists, because one could at least kind of cut some slack for the Soviet communists, in that when they took over, their rise to power was something that didn't really have much of a gestation period. Whereas the Chinese communist gestation period was something along the lines of a generation in terms of time. And yet, when you have these, when you compare these pictures of, of Cultural Revolution, well-fed and kind of buff activists, and you compare that to kind of the everyday quotidian life in China, two very, very different things. And in fact, this is something that Mao, this was a contradiction that Mao, if there was a tragedy to the life of Mao in Maoist, in Maoist terms, it was the fact that he could never reconcile to the fact that there was that the skills that made the Chinese communists successful in 1949 were not the skills to maintain the durability of the People's Republic. But in Cambodia, we have a different scenario, in that what you saw after 1975 was really just a continuation of what came before. And insofar as there were any guardrails, the guardrails that were there were that between United Front on the one hand and class struggle on the other. So, with me being 7 minutes over, let me stop here, and like I promised, there's the QR code, let me just open up the floor to any questions, comments, pushbacks, critiques, what have you, and thank you very, very much for your time.
Good time.